Hello, welcome to your academy. At your academy today in this lecture, we will deal with Introduction to A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. A Room of One's Own is one of the most famous works or one of the most famous non-fiction work written by Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf is a 20th century uh, writer, a feminist writer and a female writer. If you want to know more about Virginia Woolf, you can check out the link given at the top of this video if in case you have not gone through the life and times of Virginia Woolf. We have covered that in another lecture at your academy. But today, this particular lecture will be dedicated only to introduction of A Room of One's Own. Now, it's very important for a student of literature to know about the context and background of a particular work that he is studying or reading. Now it's very common and it's even necessary for that matter that any poem, any play, any novel, short story or a non-fiction work that you read has got a story behind the scenes which you do not know. And it's very important for us to know what happened before the particular work was published, because that gives us a sense or and some answers to some important questions. For example, why was this work written, when was this work written, how was this work written, what were the circumstances when this work was written, what was the mental situation of the writer. If we know these particular context, in that backdrop, it makes the understanding of that literary text easy for us. Again, often I say, unless you are a follower of new criticism, which would uh, uh, forbade all these activities or things in order to understand a particular works. But since we are not that ardent followers of new criticism, so we would love to hear about things that went behind the scenes of a particular work. So in this particular lecture, we will try to dwell deep into the activities that took place before this work was published, which we today know as A Room of One's Own, and which has become a manifesto for feminism or feminists or female writers or female novelists or females of England back then. And as I said earlier also, that this work, A Room of One's Own, was highly appreciated by the second wave feminism. Not only this work, but most of the works of Virginia Woolf were highly anticipated during second wave feminism. So let's see that why did Virginia Woolf write a work like A Room of One's Own? Now the story of this particular essay goes back to 1920s. And in 1920s, there was a writer known as Arnold Bennet. Now, Arnold Bennet had written a book entitled it as Our Women. In this book, Our Women, Arnold Bennet had criticized women greatly. He talked a lot of negative things about women. I'll just read a quote from Arnold Bennet's work, Our Woman, which will give us a lot of suggestions or a lot of idea about what kind of mindset men used to have back then when Virginia Woolf was thinking of writing this book or thought of writing this book, or what kind of a society she was in. Let me read out a quote from Arnold Bennett's book Our Woman. The truth is that intellectually and creatively man is the superior of woman, and that in the region of creativity, creative intellect, there are things which men almost habitually do, but which women have not done and give practically no sign of ever being able to. Now that is a very short quote from a very long and lengthy quote. You can read that if you wish, wherein he would hint at a lot of shortcomings the females have. But here what I am talking about is about the intellectual shortcomings that Bennet believed in. He would also argue later in this book that I won't comment on science because science has come recently, and women have not been a part of the scientific discoveries or scientific knowledge. Now, since they have not been part of it, it won't be fair for us to judge them scientifically. But based on the evidences that we have, they are not going to do any good in science also. Now, these were the ideas, these were the feelings, this was the attitude of males towards females back then, when Virginia Woolf was a young female, beginning to write, beginning to become an intellectual, beginning to become one of the most famous novelists or critical writer from the modernist era from the 20th century. And it was this particular quote and this particular work which offended Virginia Woolf to a great extent. And she also wrote in one of her letters that I am working on a paper wherein I'll rebut the ideals, the ideas, the attitude of Arnold Bennet towards women. And strangely, this work, Our Woman by Arnold Bennet, was also greatly supported by one of the friends of Virginia Woolf named as Desmond McCarthy. Desmond McCarthy wrote a book entitled Books in General, wherein he quoted Arnold Bennet and supported his views upon it. Now you need to remember here, though it's not very important information, but good to have, that this Desmond McCarthy, though he was a friend of Virginia Woolf, but they were not very good friends at all. Now this was the kick, you would say, this was the kick start why Virginia Woolf would begin to think about writing a work which would be a feminist manifesto. But at this point of time, she was not thinking about A Room of One's Own as a book. She was just thinking a paper, maybe a review, maybe a letter, maybe something else, which could refute the arguments of Arnold Bennet. Or, she just wanted to raise voice from the females, who could stand and counter the attacks from male society, from the patriarchal society. And I have already said in my lecture on Introduction to Feminism that one of the greatest challenge that feminists had was to break down the patriarchal society, to break down the patriarchal notions. And here, through books properly, this patriarchal notion was spread among the people. So this was the impetus that Virginia Woolf perhaps needed, and she got it from Arnold Bennet. Now, since I have told earlier also in the lecture on Virginia Woolf that Virginia Woolf belonged to a very liberal and educated family, though she was not educated formally, but she was educated informally, and in literary circles she was in friends with some of the good names like E.M. Forster, Lytton Strachey, J.M. Keynes, through Bloomsbury Group. We have also talked about that in about Virginia Woolf, so you must have gone through that lecture. Now, being friends with these people or these men, she was, quite an influential lady, and people knew her, though she was not the part of like the Cambridges and other great institutions of England, but still very famous. So because of her views and her opinions, which she would often circulate through her letters, she was invited by one of her acquaintances in Cambridge to deliver a lecture in ODTAA. Now this ODTAA, which means other one damn thing after another, which was a group of which was perhaps a society, and they wanted Virginia Woolf to deliver a lecture to their society. And Virginia Woolf, since at that time was not very famous, so she accepted their invitation. But somehow when the time came when she was supposed to present a paper or deliver a lecture, some issues popped up and appeared, and she had to postpone this particular address. Now, after postponing this particular address, later, she was invited by Art Society of Newnham in 1929 again to deliver a lecture to this particular society. And here Virginia Woolf again accepted the invitation, and this time around, which was October of 1929, she successfully delivered a lecture, addressing the gatherings of women there in Art Society of Newnham. Though, and later, a week later, she went back to Cambridge, and the earlier invitation from Erin Biss, which was about delivering lecture to ODTAA, she went to Cambridge and delivered a lecture to ODTAA also. Now, both these lectures were delivered to a gathering of females, and they addressed the issues of females. But we do not know exactly what Virginia Woolf talked about in these lectures. But we know about the title of her address at Newnham College, which was about woman and fiction. Now, woman and fiction became, an important chapter in A Room of One's Own also when it was published. Now, these were some of the circumstances, but again, as I said, we do not have, exact idea of the content of papers or speeches that Virginia Woolf delivered to either ODTAA or Arts Society of Newnham. We have no idea. But we know that Virginia Woolf was planning is that she wanted to give a history to the females, to give a conducive environment to them for writing, because she believed that in a society like England in 1920s and 30s, it was becoming very difficult for females to write. But it was not only because men were not giving them enough space, or they were not treating them like they can write. Like you get an idea from Arnold Bennet's ideas that he believed that women have got no intellectual side. They cannot write at all. They cannot read at all. So that was one aspect. But the other aspect that Virginia Woolf thought was missing for females was that there was no history for them. Because when Desmond McCarthy, supported the views of Arnold Bennet, then Virginia Woolf would, respond to the views of Desmond McCarthy through New Statesman, and the response of Virginia Woolf was, I quote, "It seems to me that the conditions which make it possible for a Shakespeare to exist are that he shall have had predecessors in his art, shall make one of a group where art is freely discussed and practiced, and shall himself have the utmost of freedom and action and experience." Here she says that what is missing for females to become as famous as William Shakespeare is history, is culture, is group. And female Virginia Woolf thought were deprived of all these things. They were not given space to write. They were not given society to write. They were not having groups wherein they can sit and discuss. And that is why perhaps, this is not, a factual statement, but this must have been one of the reasons for Virginia Woolf to, be the part of Bloomsbury group, which she was, along with E.M. Foster, along with Lytton Strachey, along with J.M. Keynes. And that particular group perhaps would have given Virginia Woolf that sort of environment, that sort of feeling, that sort of cultural inspiration or aspiration in which he eventually became a writer. And it is believed that the lectures that she delivered to ODTAA and to the Art Society of Newnham revolved around these two important themes. One was that the females have to create a space for themselves to write, and they have to create a history so that they can become the writers. There are two, important suggestions, or two important evidences that we get from the two speeches which she delivered to Newnham and to ODTAA, which gives us some idea about how this book A Room of One's Own shaped up. When she delivered the lecture at ODTAA, Virginia Woolf wrote in one of the letters or in her diary that I blandly told them at Girton to drink wine and have a room of their own. Now, from this particular statement, we get the idea about the title of this particular book, A Room of One's Own. So, which means that when Virginia Woolf was delivering her talks at different places, she must have had this particular title in her mind. And she must have had some content also related to this book in her mind. So, as she says that I told him blatantly that you should drink wine and you should have a room of one's your own, and having a room of your own would mean that you must have a space of your own where you can give time to your thoughts and to your imagination and to your fancy, and which would eventually turn into writings of literature, to novels, to short stories, to poems, to non-fictional works. But for that you need a good society, a good space of your own. And the other lecture that she delivered at to Arts Society at Newnham, later a press release or a magazine release which was released by in the magazine which is owned by Newnham, they stated or they wrote at Newnham College she talked about women and fiction. Now this is just a brief line that I am quoting. I am not quoting the whole stanza because that's not of that use, but just to get evidences that there was something in the mind of Virginia Woolf when she was delivering lectures at different places about her forthcoming book, A Room of One's Own. Eventually, later, it was perhaps in 1929 that this book, A Room of One's Own, was published.